Hello and welcome to the MovieKing Podcast. My name is David Jurmann and I'll be your host. On today's episode, I'll be reviewing Captain America: Brave New World. What has happened to Marvel Studios? They used to be such a well-regarded brand, and I think many would agree that it's the most successful franchise of all time. I mean, what they accomplished during the Infinity Saga, a story told over 20 movies with most being well-received by both critics and audiences, it's something only the likes of Pixar has achieved, and that level of consistency is hard to come by. Like, when you really think about it, this is like an entire long-term story they've been telling over 20 movies, like 10 years, and each one was consistent. Like, even the worst ones were still pretty okay. Like, they weren't bad, they weren't like anything disastrous like a Catwoman or a Batman and Robin. They were all just like, it was fine at worst, and at best, it was actually really awesome. And, even Pixar, like, they've had so much consistency too, and very few brands have that level of consistency. Star Wars doesn't have it, DC doesn't have it, even Lord of the Rings doesn't really have it with the Hobbit movies. It's just really hard to come by, and this level of overarching storytelling is also an incredible feat, and billions of dollars later, Marvel has been such a huge success. But ever since Avengers Endgame passed in 2019, the MCU has been struggling to find itself again, especially since COVID, and especially since they kind of burned out audiences with the amount of content coming out in a given year. It used to only be like 3 movies a year, and it was over the course of the entire year, so you'd get like one in February, one in May, one in November, something around that mark. And and that kind of allowed audiences to just kind of get excited for it and really be there for it. Now what's happened, though, is we have so many shows and so many movies coming out that it feels like homework to an extent, and also audiences are just kind of like, I don't really feel like I have the time to watch all this stuff. I think I'm just gonna, maybe skip some things, but that wasn't the case. Before, it used to be everyone felt like each MCU movie was essential storytelling, and even if you weren't watching it to find out what was happening next in the story, you were watching it because, like, they've all been so consistently good that you're like, oh, it's going to be a good movie anyway. So that was kind of what the MCU had going for it, and it was such a remarkable thing to happen in filmmaking, and it was so unprecedented. But now what's happened is a lot of people have kind of given up on the MCU a little bit. And not to say that it won't ever come back. I think it can, absolutely, but it's been in a place where I think it's just really hard to get audiences' trust back. And while I appreciate the greater risks in the project, and they're a bit more niche and geared towards specific types of audiences, there's been little cohesion and even less consistency in the projects. Like, I don't think people have liked even the best projects, as much as they enjoyed the ones like Infinity War and Endgame and, some of the other original movies like Iron Man. But to be fair, there were at least a few beloved movies these past few years, like Spider-Man No Way Home, which people absolutely adored. You had Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which to me is my favorite of the this whole like recent phase of the MCU, the last 2 phases, and it's just a great conclusion to the characters. And then there's Deadpool and Wolverine, which, if you've been following this podcast since the beginning, that was the first episode I did, which was back in July of last year. So, the MCU... it's been a while since we had our last MCU movie. That was the last MCU movie, Deadpool and Wolverine, but that was a fun time. I mean, I didn't love it or anything, but generally speaking, audiences kind of respected that movie the way they did older MCU movies. And I've also been reading a book about the MCU and its history, so that's been pretty fascinating. I've been learning a lot of just kind of how the MCU came to be and what the challenges were at first and how they've kind of been overcoming them. Very interesting read. Definitely give that a read. It's called like MCU, I think. Just a good book. But in any case, now we have Captain America: Brave New World, a follow-up to many past films and shows such as the Captain America trilogy, Eternals, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and The Incredible Hulk. While no homework is required for this viewing, I don't think like you have to know these characters and other movies and what happens to like enjoy this movie by itself per se. You may feel a little bit lost if you haven't seen the latter 2 projects, being Falcon and the Winter Soldier and The Incredible Hulk. Because interestingly enough, this is a Captain America movie that is also a sequel to a Hulk movie from 2008, and may I add, it's not a very well-received movie either. There are characters and storylines from that movie being referenced here, and some directly impact the story. Like, there are some big things from that movie that come back here. So definitely give that movie a rewatch if you kind of are a big MCU fanatic and want to be on top of everything. And the same goes for Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which officially saw the Falcon take on the Captain America mantle and had some pretty big events that also kind of, give some fan service here if you watch that show. I don't think that one's as necessary as Incredible Hulk, but it's good to watch it if you're going into this movie. Now, critic reviews and audience reception haven't been all that positive to say the least for Brave New World. The film currently has about 50% on Rotten Tomatoes from critics, so very split. The audience score is around an 80, so more positive on there. But if you take a look at the cinema score, it tells a bit of a different story. It's only a B minus. And basically the way cinema score works is people walk out of the theater opening night, opening day. The cinema score people give like the theater some kind of like fill out sheets, and the audience can fill that out. So cinema score is really the way of seeing how did the opening night crowd enjoy this movie? Like, how did the target audience enjoy this movie? Whereas, like, Rotten Tomatoes is just looking at everyone, whether you were going or not, excited or not, it's looking at your score. Cinema score, though, is like, if you went opening night, you are probably the most hyped person for the movie. So it's kind of looking at how did this movie meet the expectations of the target audience. And cinema score, generally speaking, if you get, an A minus, that's really nice. An A plus is great. Obviously, A plus is like very rare, but it's amazing. B plus, not so good. B is not good at all, and a B minus is actually kind of disastrous for a comic book movie of this size. And that's what this movie got. It's a B minus, which for context is worse than any other MCU movie. I think the worst before this was a B. So if you thought like Quantumania and Eternals weren't all that great, know that this is even lower from audiences. And it's also worse than Batman v Superman, a movie that was incredibly divisive among fans, and most people would probably say wasn't a good movie. As for the quality of Captain America Brave New World, in my opinion, I found it to be fine. Look, it's not bad. Not at all, actually. It's just not... It's not as bad to me as some of the other, like, bad MCU movies we've gotten recently, like I said, Quantumania or even the Marvels, but it is bottom tier MCU. Mainly because, like, besides 3 projects or so, I don't flat out dislike many of them. There are absolutely some positive elements here, though. For one, Sam is still a good character, and it's great to see him as Captain America again. If he ends up being a big part of the next Avengers team, I'll be excited to see where they take his character next. And Anthony Mackie is still excellent in the role. He's a really good actor. He does a great job. And I also think Harrison Ford is great as Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross. He's replacing the late William Hurt, and I think he was just a great choice to fill in the role. You might be going into this movie from the trailers to see him as Red Hulk. If you are, don't. If you are, like, please don't go in with that mindset. Go in for President Ross because it's mainly what you get, and it's also where his performance shines. And even though the Red Hulk stuff is very cool, there's not much of it. Like, it's very little amount, so don't go in for that. The other standout in the cast is Carl Lumbly, who was a great part of Falcon and the Winter Soldier as a show. I think he's one of the best parts of this movie, too. I love his chemistry with Anthony Mackie, and he has some good dramatic scenes. He's a very good actor. I like what he brought to this movie a lot, as well as the show I mentioned. And additionally, I like what this movie is doing, and it's trying to go back to the more grounded thriller elements we had in some of the other Captain America movies, namely Winter Soldier and Civil War. And there are some good sequences to come from this too. I think there's just like a few very nice scenes that just kind of remind you of those earlier Captain America movies with sort of the more, let's say, gritty feeling to it. I don't think this is quite on those levels, but it does a decent job at times. And I think there were also a few good heart-to-heart scenes towards the end that were pretty nice. And, I won't say, like, they moved me much, but I think they did work. Like, they felt nice and earned. Moving on to the negatives, though, it's really just that nothing in this movie stands out much. It doesn't do anything particularly well, and most of it is okay at best. There's never like that one action scene that makes you go, wow, that was awesome. And there's never that reveal in the plot that makes you go, like, wait, really? Like, that's what this is? It's not that kind of movie. And it's disappointing because I think, like, when you go into these kind of movies, you expect a bit more out of it. And it just kind of reminds me of the first Captain Marvel in that sense, where it's just an okay movie. And it doesn't really do anything particularly well, but it's watchable. I mean, I think at least in that movie it had a few more redeeming qualities that maybe stood out a little more, like the scrolls and some more impressive visual effects. Which leads me to another thing. Besides Red Hulk, most of the visual effects in this movie look a bit dated. Not quite on the same level as like The Flash or anything, but they do look a bit, let's say, CW-ish. That's kind of like the term I think people have been using now. Like, it looks like a CW show. It's not terrible, but it's definitely a bit, like, that doesn't look too convincing. And the movie as a whole doesn't feel like a big MCU movie like we're used to. It feels more like a high-budget TV show, like what we got in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I think maybe that's partly to do with the scale of it. It just doesn't feel like that big MCU movie where, like, yeah, this is an event. It feels just more like an episode of a show. The movie is also paced pretty slowly, and I just didn't feel much excitement throughout most of it until the third act when we finally get some big, kind of showdowns going on. Another thing is that the villain is pretty weak here. I actually think the villain could have been really cool given who they are, but the motive is alright, I guess. It just didn't feel like there was much of a looming threat. I also thought the design was lame compared to what it could have been, but I do get the decision behind it. It was kind of related to what happens in the story, but I wasn't a huge fan of the design either. And lastly, the plot is very predictable. For a political thriller, it just doesn't have much intrigue or any significant moments that would have you on the edge of your seat. Like what Marvel did with Captain America, the Winter Soldier in particular, was awesome. It was intense, there was personal conflict, it had big stakes but a grounded feel. It just kind of got all those elements of like a big thriller right. And Brave New World doesn't have much of that. It just doesn't really capture that personal conflict. It doesn't have that, great action scene or the big stakes that you really want it to have in the way that you think they should feel. And I don't know if that's partly because a lot of MCU movies lately just kind of, towards the end, they just feel like kind of over the top, maybe a bit too big and not really like emotionally satisfying like they used to be. I don't know. This movie kind of has that too, where I'm like, I feel like I should feel more by the end of it, but I just don't. It's really just an okay, mediocre movie. There's stuff I enjoyed, for sure, stuff I didn't, but nothing that really made me think, wow, that was great, or dang, that sucked. Like, it wasn't really either end of that spectrum. It was just kind of right in the middle, a movie that I don't really have any interest to watch again, and it's not a movie that I'll be thinking about for any time. I don't know, it's not really any movie that has much to say. Supposedly, this movie also had some significant reshoots, including one character as like a side villain. But honestly, I couldn't tell all that much. I feel like in some cases, like reshoots are very obvious. Like you're like, oh, that's definitely a reshoot. That was no way that was there before. In this case, I think it's not that obvious. I mean, maybe again, like Marvel does reshoots for every movie, and most of them are like a pretty standard amount. Supposedly, I mean, there are very varying reports on how many, like reshoots this movie actually had, like whether it was more than average or an actual average amount. To me, it felt like a pretty average amount. Like, maybe like the things added were more significant, but I didn't feel like the reshoots really changed the feel to the movie as a whole. I don't know. As for the movie, though, it's completely inoffensive, and I think the reviews kind of tell the entire story that a lot of people are fairly indifferent on the movie. Everyone's pretty mixed on it, whether it be leaning positive or negative. You're just kind of like watching, like, I don't really, I'm mixed on it. Like, I don't think there's a lot of people out there who really loved it or a lot of people who hated it. It's just a lot of people who are mixed. And therefore, it's not going to be anyone's favorite or least favorite MCU movie, probably. It's just kind of like, it's just kind of there. I'm leaning a bit more negative on the film, but it certainly could have been worse, especially coming from the director of The Cloverfield Paradox, which was my least favorite movie of 2018. but I don't know. This isn't a movie I would really go that far with. It's not like terrible. It's just really nothing special. So I'm going to rate it a C. And that about does it for this episode. If you want to follow my reviews, you can find me on Letterboxd at MovieKing1224. You can also listen to this podcast on your favorite apps such as Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. If you have any comments or feedback, I would love to hear it and improve the show. And of course, if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell to hear more like it. I appreciate you all so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.